Let's dig into this one, because this guy really didn't like my answer. He replied again after this, basically told me I was stupid and needed to learn things, and he really didn't like my reply after that, which was very polite, well worded. But after that, he deleted his comment and he blocked me. So let's actually look at this, because apparently some people think that chain speed is related to bar length. And chain speed is not measured in the time that it takes the chain to make a revolution around the bar. It's measured in distance. When we look at the workshop manuals, we get chain speed. This is in metric, so it's in meters per second. And this has nothing to do with this. This is decided by chain pitch and sprocket rim driver count. And these numbers are all, in this book, they're based on assuming a 7-pin. But if we look here, so the 262, it's 18.5 meters per second at 9,600 RPM. So that's a 325 setup. 268, 18.4 at 9,000. That is a 387. We see the 272 on that page. We're at 20 meters per second at 9,300 RPM. 20 meters per second roughly works out to 4,000 feet per minute. I won't bore you with doing the math, but 20 meters per second is, we'll round that out to 37 feet per minute. And let's look 3120, 20.1 at 9,000, and that's because it's dealing with a 404. So even though it's still a 7-pin, you travel more distance for each tooth on the driver. So let's take a look at that 272 setup. We're at 20 meters per second, so we'll work with a nice round number. And we know that we're at 20 meters per second at 9,300 RPM with a 7-pin. So let's look at what changing that to an 8-pin does. So this is going to be pretty simple. 20 divided by 7 multiplied by 8. So we're now going to be 22.86 meters per second with an 8-pin. So that brings us up to 4,500 feet per minute. That's a pretty substantial jump. So to put it in terms that are pretty easy to understand, we'll say that the 7-pin, being the standard, is like having your 5-speed manual in 4th gear, and that's direct 1-to-1. You put that sucker into 5th, now you're into overdrive. And that's why when you run an 8-pin, you have less available torque, and sometimes the saw goes slower, especially in harder wood. So let's actually look at it on a saw, and we'll turn our sprocket rim one turn, and we'll measure how far we went, and then we'll swap it for an 8-pin. So here we go. One turn pretty much. And we're just going to roughly measure here. We will call that, we went, call it 13 centimeters for my metric friends, or more or less 5 1/4 inches if we're in standard. Now let's reset and swap that out for an 8-pin. That's over the way. So get everything back together here. We'll get lined up again. Let's just see where we end up. Here's our marked link lineup. We'll go with our marks here, so right there on our sprocket rim. And there is one turn. And now we have traveled, we'll call that 6 inches, or about 15.5 centimeters. So that's why we get more chain speed with a bigger driver, because we've increased the gear ratio. Now we could grab any other saw, do the same thing with the same sprocket. Doesn't matter what bar length we're dealing with, we're going to get the same results when we're dealing with the same pitch. We go to a different pitch drive, and it's going to go a different distance per drive tooth, but it's going to be a constant on that as well. So between this 18 and that 13, the same engine RPM is going to make that chain travel the same feet per minute no matter what you do. The difference is, and this is where you'll see more chain speed with a smaller bar, is there is a lot less resistance on that shorter bar. So as long as the engine is able to overcome the loading to maintain the same engine RPM, you're going to have the same chain speed. But when it comes to a shorter bar, you have less parasitic loss, you have less friction, and that makes it a little bit easier for the saw to maintain RPM. On shorter bars like this, even an 18 isn't that long, you're not really going to notice a big difference. Even with this 32, we're going to have that same 20 meter per second chain speed with the 7-pin rim at 9,300 RPM. This 181 might not be the happiest about maintaining that RPM, but that's a different ballgame. So at the end of the day, let's say I grab a 266 off the shelf, and I'm going to go and cut a 12-inch log with it. I've got a 13-inch bar, and I've got a 24-inch bar. Say the chain is prepared exactly the same on both of them, equal sharpness, equal raker setting. My cut times are going to be so close that it's not even worth talking about the difference outside of competition. At the end of the day, engine RPM, the number of pins in the driver, and your chain pitch are what determine your chain speed. Increasing the number of pins or adding a cog to the gear is like going to a higher gear ratio in a manual transmission. So you've increased your speed per RPM, but you've also reduced your available torque. So while the math says that at the same engine RPM that chain is going to travel faster, you may not have the power available to maintain that RPM. And like I very recently put up a video of the 2171 with a 7-pin and an 8-pin in the same log. And with the chain that was on it, an 8-pin actually made it go slower because the torque was not there to pull the chain.